So today we're going to be looking at something very, very simple, and that is the question, what is OSR and how is it different than what we're used to with 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons? We'll go ahead and get started with just the basic information for what OSR is, which goes back a couple different acronyms, but most commonly online, what I've done in my last couple weeks of research here is the old school revival. And this is sort of an idea that was conjured up, and some people say it never really went anywhere. It was just, some people stuck with the older editions of D&D while others started to develop their own separate systems as Dungeons & Dragons evolved more into this. But regardless, the OSR, or the old school revival, is this new trend of people switching back to these sorts of game styles, in particular more modernized versions of classic fantasy Dungeons & Dragons. Although some people would consider sticking with the 1st or 2nd editions Dungeons & Dragons or Advanced Dungeons & Dragons to be a part of this revival. Now, to go ahead and get started with just the most simple, basic information, the OSR rules are typically going to be very, very sandbox style, where players are going to have a really high risk. Now, one thing in basic fantasy role-playing game, which is apparently a very popular OSR title, when it comes to your players and fighting in combat, there's a very good chance that they don't make it out alive. When your character reaches 0 HP, they're dead. That's the end of the story. And most of these characters, right, depending on their class, they only have at the first 5 levels up to 1d6 per level for the clerics, d8s for the fighters, and then you have d4s for your magic users and your thieves. So everybody is very, very low hit points, very squishy. And even at a level 4 thief, for example, is only 4d4 hit points, and that's minus any constitution modifiers they might have up to 1. And so one of my players, who is a thief in my current game that I'm running, utilizing this rule set here, he is a thief with -2 to his constitution, which maxes out at 1. And on top of rolling poorly and just overall bad luck from his starting stats, he's a level 3 thief right now with I think 3 hit points, which is incredibly low. I mean, enemies are going to be able to, if they needed to, if they wanted to, they could kill him in a single hit, which is absolutely insane for a level 3 character. Let's just quickly compare that to 5th edition and their rogue, which is their version of the thief. At per level, the thieves or the rogues, they get access to 1d8 hit dice per level, which is incredible. That's twice the size of a hit die. And so 1d8 versus 1d4. We're talking about a level 3 rogue having 15 HP by level 3, right? 5 times the total amount of hit points that my rogue has in the OSR system back here. There's a much higher emphasis in OSR rules on player agency and also on exploration, right? Going out and exploring and finding things and using their, again, imaginations, but also role play, and getting into character and thinking, what would my character do rather than what is on my character sheet that I can do. They get to have a much more personalized experience where they become much more a part of their character instead of just looking at whatever's on their sheet and flipping through this big list of things that they can do according to the rule book. To go back to our example earlier, another thing, right, is going to be embracing the fact that there's not going to be always 100% balance. With an OSR rule system, this goblin here, with one strike of its weapon, if it's successful, is enough to kill a player, right? And there's no revives, there's no death saves, there's no coming back. In this system, or in most OSR systems, it's very lethal. And so, yeah, there's going to be asymmetry. It's not always going to be fair. But that doesn't mean that you have to take on the fight in that direction. Another quick example is last week whenever I was playing a game, my campaign with my players, they met with a War Orc boss that was pretty much one of the strongest individuals on the continent that they were on. He was hundreds of years old. He had seen hundreds of battles, killed thousands of men, and he had a pretty high AC of 18. My players are level 2 and 3. They had absolutely no chance at all of being able to stop him. And yet, I had a couple players that continued to hit at him, and most of their attacks weren't even able to hit, but when they did, they were doing 4, 5, 6, 7 damage, but he had hit points pushing 300 or more, and so it would have been not a good time if they had actually gotten into a fight with him. He was, killing their NPC allies left and right to try to stop the fight and so that he could have a conversation with them. And that kind of opened up the door of, hey, maybe we don't have to solve this problem with violence. We can maybe solve this problem with, talking things out. Let's hear what he has to say. Obviously, if he could kill us, he would, but he's not, so maybe let's hear what he's got to say. And because it was so lethal, because it was so asymmetrical, it kind of threw the players through a loop, because they hadn't ever fought one of these war orcs yet, and so this was really the first time when they got to go hand-to-hand against one, and they truly saw how terrifying it was, and it really puts it into perspective for your players. Now, a huge part that cannot be forgotten when it comes to OSR is nostalgia, right? With OSR, you have so much more nostalgia for what some people might consider the good old days of Dungeons and Dragons, when it was, you get around the table and you see this classic fantasy art. I mean, it's just like what's on the cover, right? You see this classic fantasy art that you've seen done over time and time again, and it just sort of brings back memories if you played back then, and even if you didn't play back then, it can still give you that same sort of vibes, I guess you could say, of what it may have been like, and just going back to a simpler time when you didn't have really expensive art, you definitely didn't have AI art being utilized as well. It was simple art. The guys and gals that were painting and drawing this art out, they were players too. They weren't professional artists normally. And so it just created this really cool atmosphere that you don't really get anymore with most of your standard games. Even like 3rd and 4th edition of Dungeons and Dragons, you really don't get that anymore. And so having access to that nostalgia bomb with OSR, or even if you're going to run an old game using these old rules here from AD&D or anything like that, you're going to have a huge burst of nostalgia and vibes that you just cannot get from these newer systems. So to wrap everything up, OSR, this old school Renaissance style gaming here, are going to be best for people that prefer a little bit higher risk, older school experience with much simpler mechanics, greater focus on exploration, and emphasis on creativity. I mean, you cannot get this from these systems here. Whereas 5th edition D&D or 5.5 or D&D 2024, whatever we're in right now, is going to be a little bit better for people who want that more forgiving kind of gameplay where it's much more structured. There's a very, big but rigid set of rules that aren't really designed to be broken. Not a lot of homebrew or room for homebrew, that sort of thing. And it's going to be much more focused on your character's progression as they level up. Something that I always think back to with 5th edition and even 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons is that it feels like a video game. It feels like you're playing World of Warcraft or some other big MMORPG where you have to grind levels to get these certain things, and when you unlock this, it lets you get to this other thing, which then you can stack on top of and top of on top of until eventually you have this insanely overpowered, level 20 character. Whereas in here, your levels don't really matter as much. It's within basic fantasy RPG in particular, when you level up, pretty much other than being able to have a slightly better chance to hit, you get an extra, plus to your hit, you get an extra hit dice, and if you're a magic user, you typically get a spell slot or 2. But other than that, you really don't get a whole lot when you level up. You don't have all the extra attacks, you don't have the specialities and things like that that you can go into, and you certainly don't have subclasses you have to worry about. Now, if you want to role play any of those things, you're totally welcome to do so. And the best part about these OSR systems is just because there's not a rule for them doesn't mean you can't do it. So talk to the Dungeon Master about it. I'm sure that he will be very glad that you did, because you're showing interest in your character and in the game that they're creating for you. And so I think if it were up to me, I would choose OSR or even a classic Dungeons & Dragons experience. Now that I've done a few weeks of research into this, I kind of stumbled into this OSR system by accident, and as I pointed out in a comment on one of my earliest videos, I didn't really know what I was getting into with this. I didn't even know what OSR was, but now I've delved into this huge community, and it is super welcoming. Everybody here is fantastic, and it seems like we all have the same sort of thing on our minds. We all want to have fun. We all want to play classic Dungeons & Dragons, and we don't love the direction that it sort of went. And as somebody who played this for almost a decade now, once a week for 6, 7, 8 years, I don't know how long, with almost the same group of friends the whole time too, we've really learned what we like about the game and what we don't like. And so as we've sort of grown out of this, we're sort of longing for a system more like this. And I'm sure that if you have a similar play group, or maybe you just don't love this system, if you give these a shot, I think you won't regret it. Have a great rest of your evening.